January 17, 1940, a biting wind swept across the plains of northern France. Frost clung to the edges of the rail cars that carried the men, and the whispers of orders, etched in ink, sealed in envelopes. Inside a dimly lit headquarters, maps were pinned to wooden walls, their corners curling with the weight of strategy and secrecy. Officers moved like shadows between flickering lamps, papers rustling in hands that trembled not from cold, but from the knowledge of what was about to be set in motion. In the silence, broken only by distant artillery tests and the clatter of typewriters, a single directive sat on the commander's desk. It was unremarkable in appearance, a sheet of standard-issue paper with a stamp and a signature. Yet the contents of this order carried the power to shift the balance of an entire front. Not a single soldier would understand it fully until the moment it had to be obeyed or questioned. Outside, the world slept unaware. But here, in this frozen room, history held its breath. The next few hours would test loyalty, courage, and the limits of obedience. And when the ink had dried and the order had traveled down the chain, some would vanish from records as if they had never existed at all. From these quiet beginnings, the events that followed would ripple across battlefields, cities, and lives, shaping the war in ways no one could yet imagine. By the winter of 1939, Europe was a continent poised on a knife's edge. Germany had moved with devastating speed in Poland, crushing resistance in weeks and redrawing borders with the efficiency of a machine, leaving the world stunned. France and Britain had declared war, but for months the Western Front remained eerily quiet. Soldiers called it the phony war. A lull of anticipation, yet beneath the calm, armies prepared for a confrontation that promised to eclipse the devastation of the last conflict. In Berlin, High Command's corridors hummed with tension. Hitler's generals debated strategy with a mixture of confidence and unease. The rapid victory in the East had exposed weaknesses, supply lines stretched, intelligence patchy. Winter looming, and yet, in the shadows of these discussions, certain directives were drafted with almost casual secrecy. Orders that were not meant for broad distribution, designed to alter the tempo of war in ways that few outside the inner circle could understand. Across the Rhine, the French army fortified the Maginot Line, its concrete and steel a symbol of defensive certainty. Soldiers trudged through snow-laden trenches, adjusting to long nights punctuated by the distant echo of artillery tests. Morale fluctuated, optimism wavering as months of inaction bred frustration. British expeditionary forces landed at French ports, ready to support allies but constrained by the logistics of distance and the fear of repeating the errors of 1914. Intelligence services on both sides operated with varying success. German cryptographers intercepted fragments of Allied communications, while French and British codebreakers strained to anticipate movements that seemed to come from an invisible hand. In this fog, the importance of a single order, its timing, wording, and secrecy could not be overstated. A misstep could cost tens of thousands of lives, yet a correct decision could pivot the war entirely. The European stage was set. Armies braced, generals argued over maps, and men in uniform, some barely trained. Others, hardened by years of drilling, prepared to execute instructions whose significance they could scarcely comprehend. It was in this environment of anticipation, secrecy, and mounting tension that the orders which would later vanish from the historical record were conceived. Their presence was a quiet pulse beneath the clamor of strategy meetings and the rustle of winter wind across frozen fields, waiting for the moment to be felt. In these frozen months, the war had paused on the surface, but beneath it, currents of strategy and command flowed with urgency. These currents would carry the orders forward, shaping battles, decisions, and fates in ways that only hindsight could fully reveal. And yet, even now, the world outside these rooms remained unaware of the invisible lines being drawn, lines that would soon force soldiers, commanders, and entire nations to act. By early 1940, the focus of German strategy had shifted westward. The Polish campaign was concluded, but the Wehrmacht faced a complex puzzle: how to break through the French defenses and force a decisive confrontation. Intelligence reports were contradictory. French troop deployments were irregular, the terrain unpredictable, and the Maginot Line, though formidable, covered only part of the border. Meanwhile, Belgian and Dutch neutrality complicated movements. Any misstep risked international outrage and potential entanglement with additional forces. Within the German High Command, officers debated operational approaches. Blitzkrieg tactics, rapid mechanized assaults combined with concentrated air support had proven devastating in Poland. But France's defenses and the ever-present Allied forces required careful calibration. Logistics became a central concern. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to be pre-positioned across hundreds of kilometers, while communication lines stretched to their limits. In this environment, the precision and secrecy of every order mattered. One ambiguous directive could stall an armored advance or expose an infantry unit to annihilation. The orders in question, drafted in Berlin and disseminated through select channels, were not part of standard operational planning. They addressed contingencies, maneuvers, and priorities that seemed obscure, even contradictory, to the men who received them. Some involved rapid redeployment. Others required restraint in attacking certain positions, decisions that flew in the face of conventional military logic. Only commanders with access to the full intelligence picture could appreciate the rationale, and even they understood it carried enormous risk. In the field, officers struggled to reconcile these directives with reality. German panzer divisions moved along narrow roads, forested paths, and frozen river crossings. Signals were intercepted, supply convoys delayed, and weather imposed further constraints. Meanwhile, Allied reconnaissance monitored every movement, yet often misread the intentions behind the orders. The tension was compounded by political pressure from Berlin. The Führer demanded decisive results, leaving commanders caught between obedience and battlefield pragmatism. This was a war of anticipation. Every action, every hesitation would ripple through the chain of command. Soldiers felt it in the cold mornings, in the silent waiting before an order was delivered. Some sensed that what they were about to do was larger than a simple offensive or defensive maneuver. They were participating in a sequence of decisions whose full consequences would only emerge months or years later. By the end of winter, the stage was set. The armies were in position, the commands had been issued, and the hidden orders waited like an unseen hand over the battlefield. Soon, their influence would be undeniable, driving men and machines toward a climax that would shock those who witnessed it, and confound those who studied it afterward. For the soldiers on the ground, the orders arrived like shadows in the fog of war. Many were young men, barely out of training, their faces etched with frost and fatigue, hands calloused from rifles and shovels. They read the directives quickly, the words precise yet opaque, and passed them along to the next level of command. Some questioned their feasibility. Others obeyed instinctively, trusting that the hierarchy had reasoned through what they could not see. In the villages and forests of northern France, men moved silently, listening for the distant rattle of artillery, the faint hum of approaching trucks, and the occasional echo of a comrade's cough. The orders demanded rapid repositioning and coordination across units that had never trained together. Misreading a line could mean the difference between holding a hill and being cut off entirely. Soldiers felt the weight of responsibility, even when their understanding was limited. Every misstep could be fatal, yet every hesitation risked offending the chain of command. At the top, commanders wrestled with a dual burden: political expectation and battlefield reality. Hitler's insistence on aggressive, decisive action forced generals to act swiftly, often with incomplete information. Some orders were deliberately ambiguous, a mechanism to force initiative among subordinate officers or to shield higher command from blame if the plan failed. Field commanders faced impossible decisions. One division might be tasked with holding a defensive line while simultaneously preparing to advance hundreds of kilometers under enemy observation. The orders required foresight, timing, and precision in execution, leaving little margin for error. High command relied on a combination of trust, obedience, and the hope that their instructions would achieve intended outcomes. In these moments, leadership was not just a matter of strategy. It was a measure of judgment under pressure, tempered by fear and the constant awareness of human cost. The execution of the orders was inextricably linked to technology. German panzer divisions depended on mechanized transport. radio communications, and fuel logistics that were vulnerable to disruption. Tanks could advance quickly, but only if roads were clear, supply lines intact, and crews adequately trained. Artillery support had to be synchronized precisely, while aircraft reconnaissance supplied fragmented intelligence that commanders had to interpret on the fly. Even a minor mechanical failure could cascade into disaster. An immobilized vehicle, a misfired artillery round, or a jammed radio could halt an advance, expose flanks, and jeopardize entire battalions. The orders were designed with these technological realities in mind, exploiting strengths while masking weaknesses. Yet, despite the meticulous planning, the interplay of human skill and mechanical reliability introduced uncertainty at every turn. Soldiers and commanders alike depended on machines they neither fully controlled nor entirely trusted, tension that would amplify the stakes of every decision. For the Allies, the orders were a riddle wrapped in shadows. German movements were meticulously planned yet deliberately obscured. Reconnaissance units reported troop concentrations that seemed inconsistent with expected maneuvers. French intelligence officers pored over intercepted messages, attempting to predict the enemy's intentions. Every report hinted at something larger, a decisive action looming just beyond the horizon, but clarity never arrived. This uncertainty forced the Allies into defensive postures, slowing countermeasures and creating hesitation in the chain of command. Belgian and Dutch forces were particularly vulnerable, their neutrality limiting their options and leaving them exposed to sudden incursions. From the German perspective, the secrecy embedded in the orders was itself a weapon, a psychological tool that eroded confidence and amplified fear in the enemy. By the time the Allies realized the scale of the operation, much of the momentum had already shifted. On the battlefield, the orders translated into a complex choreography of movement, timing, and coordination. Panzer units advanced along narrow corridors, infantry followed on parallel routes, and artillery rained precise fire on key points, all timed to create confusion and exploitation of weak spots. Rapid redeployments challenged traditional tactical thinking. Defensive lines had to be abandoned or reoriented in hours rather than days. Small decisions, when to halt, when to advance, when to consolidate, could determine success or catastrophe. Commanders in the field faced constant adaptation, reacting to shifting enemy positions, weather conditions, and the unforeseen consequences of prior orders. This dynamic interplay created a battlefield where the initiative was both a weapon and a liability, forcing officers and soldiers to improvise while adhering to directives they sometimes barely understood. The orders also carried weight far beyond tactics and strategy. They forced soldiers and officers to confront ethical dilemmas in real time. Some instructions involved restraint in attacking civilian infrastructure or avoiding unnecessary casualties, while others implicitly demanded ruthless efficiency. Those tasked with execution had to balance obedience with conscience, often under fire and with split-second decisions. In retrospect, historians have debated the morality of these directives. Were they a necessary adaptation to the brutal realities of modern warfare, or a calculated mechanism to exploit ambiguity and preserve the appearance of plausible deniability? Soldiers on both sides navigated this gray zone daily, their actions constrained by duty, fear, and the immediate pressures of survival. The tension between morality and obedience became another battlefield, one that left scars not recorded in maps or reports but etched into memory. May 10, 1940, at dawn the Western Front erupted. German forces crossed into Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, their movements precise, swift, and seemingly unstoppable. The orders that had traveled in secrecy for months now guided every tank, every infantry column, every artillery strike. Panzer divisions rolled along narrow roads, their engines roaring through forests and open fields alike. Soldiers, previously anxious, moved with a mixture of disciplined instinct and cautious anticipation, following commands whose full rationale they would only understand in hindsight. At Sedan, along the Meuse River, the implications of the orders became tangible. French defenses, fortified for a static war, were suddenly outflanked. Bridges were seized with daring speed, artillery fire pinned down infantry, and engineers repaired roads under enemy observation to maintain momentum. The German High Command had anticipated the gaps and hesitations in the Allied deployment, and the orders orchestrated a decisive exploitation. Within hours, entire French divisions found themselves trapped between advancing armored columns and defensive positions that could no longer hold. The human element intensified the chaos. Soldiers on both sides faced the immediacy of danger and the weight of command. German officers relayed instructions with clipped urgency, aware that delay or misinterpretation could unravel the meticulously planned advance. French units struggled to respond, often receiving contradictory intelligence. Civilian populations in the path of movement were forced into sudden evacuation, caught between the advance of mechanized forces and the unpredictability of war's next turn. Air support amplified the effect. Stuka dive bombers roared overhead, striking supply depots and disrupting communication lines. Radio operators relayed fragmented reports, while forward observers improvised, attempting to adjust artillery fire based on rapidly shifting conditions. The battlefield became a living system of motion, every action feeding into the next, guided by orders that, though written in quiet rooms far from the front, now determined life and death with ruthless precision. By nightfall, the first signs of the order's profound impact were visible. Allied defensive lines were fractured. Panic and confusion rippled through command posts. Yet the full consequences remained in motion. Soldiers, officers, and commanders alike sensed that the coming days would demand even greater adaptation, courage, and improvisation. The orders had set the stage, but the outcome, the pivot of the campaign, was still unfolding. By May 12, 1940, the German advance had reached a point of irreversible momentum. At the Meuse, Sedan's bridges had been seized, and panzer divisions poured across the river, cutting into the heart of French defensive lines. The orders, originally cryptic, now vividly realized, dictated a pace and coordination that the Allies could not match. French and Belgian forces scrambled, attempting counterattacks and repositioning units, but the rapidity of the German maneuver rendered many decisions moot before they could be executed. At the tactical level, every success reinforced the strategy embedded in the orders. Mechanized columns moved in concert with infantry, artillery, and air support, creating overlapping zones of pressure. Entire French divisions were encircled in pockets they could not escape. The human cost was immediate. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, their confusion compounded by the precision of the German advance. Commanders struggled to communicate, their radios jammed by the speed and unpredictability of the assault. The battlefield became a network of motion and reaction, guided not by instinct alone, but by the invisible hand of a document whose existence few fully understood. For the German leadership, the stakes were profound. Each decision executed under the orders reinforced Hitler's expectation of rapid success while simultaneously exposing subordinate commanders to extraordinary risk. The margin for error was vanishingly thin. Yet the gamble worked. The collapse of Allied lines in Belgium and northern France accelerated faster than intelligence had predicted. Resistance pockets formed, then disintegrated under relentless pressure. By the evening of May 14th, German forces had created a corridor hundreds of kilometers long, threatening to split the Allied front entirely and forcing a desperate recalibration of strategy in London and Paris. Amid the chaos, human courage and error intertwined. Soldiers improvised under fire, medics worked frantically in improvised field hospitals, and officers made split-second decisions that could determine the survival of their men. Civilians fled along roads clogged with retreating armies, witnessing destruction, fear, and the raw intensity of modern warfare. The orders, once just words on paper, had translated into movement, destruction, and fear, altering the very geography of the front. By the close of the first week of the offensive, it was clear the orders had achieved their immediate objective. The German advance had fractured the Allied front, disrupted defensive planning, and created an opening that would shape the rest of the campaign. Yet the long-term consequences, the human toll, the shifts in strategy, and the political repercussions were only beginning to reveal themselves. The battlefield, now scarred and chaotic, bore the imprint of a single extraordinary command, written in secrecy, executed with precision, and remembered in fragments. By late May 1940, the consequences of the secret orders were already etched across the Western Front. German forces had surged through Belgium and northern France with a velocity that stunned Allied command. French and Belgian divisions were fragmented, their units scattered or encircled. Estimates of casualties in these opening days varied, but reports documented thousands killed, wounded, and captured. Prisoner lists grew longer by the hour, each name a reminder of how rapidly command decisions could translate into human loss. Allied morale faltered under the psychological weight of the collapse. Soldiers, previously confident in the security of fortified positions, now faced the terrifying reality of a mobile, relentless enemy. Field commanders confronted a crisis of trust and communication. Radios crackled with fragmented messages, often conflicting with orders from higher command. Reinforcements were delayed or misdirected. Panic seeped into garrisons. Civilians fled along highways clogged with retreating forces, and the sense of inevitability began to settle over the front. For the German side, the orders had achieved spectacular results. Commanders on the ground felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. Mechanized units pushed beyond expected limits, artillery crews worked tirelessly to maintain fire support, and logistical teams raced to keep fuel, ammunition, and food flowing to the front lines. Success, however, came with tension. The speed of the advance meant that any misstep could stall the operation or leave flanks exposed. Officers constantly weighed risk against the order's precise intentions, understanding that deviation could negate weeks of planning. Reports filtering back to Berlin painted a picture of both euphoria and caution. Hitler and his generals recognized the magnitude of the operation's early success, yet they were acutely aware that overextension could invite disaster. Strategic reserves were readied, communications tightened, and reconnaissance intensified. The orders had opened a window, a critical opportunity, but the war's outcome was far from settled. Even in cities behind the front lines, the reverberations were felt. News of rapid German advances spread quickly, reshaping political calculations and public perception. Allied governments scrambled to formulate new strategies, while military analysts struggled to comprehend the speed and precision of the maneuvers dictated by the now famous orders. Civilians and soldiers alike would carry the shock of these days long after the artillery had fallen silent, a reminder of how profoundly a single set of directives could reshape a theater of war. As June 1940 approached, the long shadow of the orders stretched far beyond the battlefield. The German breakthrough forced a fundamental reevaluation of Allied strategy. France's military doctrine built around static defense and methodical mobilization had been rendered obsolete in a matter of weeks. Senior French commanders faced political scrutiny and internal reckoning, while British leadership began planning evacuation and long-term resistance. The collapse of the Western Front was no longer a distant possibility, it was unfolding in real time. For Germany, the success reshaped strategic thinking. The orders validated the concept of rapid, mechanized warfare coordinated across land and air. Yet they also revealed vulnerabilities. Supply lines were dangerously extended, armored units exhausted, and command structures strained by the pace of operations. German generals quietly debated how close the campaign had come to disaster had even one critical element failed. Victory had been achieved, but it was narrower than the public narrative suggested. It was during this period that the orders began to recede from view. Official records referenced outcomes and movements, but the precise wording, dissemination, and internal debates surrounding the directives were increasingly absent. Some documents were classified, others quietly revised or omitted in post-war accounts. Historians later noted discrepancies between operational reports and personal diaries, suggesting that the order's existence was intentionally obscured perhaps to protect reputations, preserve political narratives, or conceal the degree of risk involved. Among veterans, memories persisted in fragments. Officers recalled unusual instructions that contradicted standard doctrine. Soldiers remembered sudden changes in direction, unexpected halts or advances, and moments when the logic of movement only became clear long afterward. These recollections, often recorded years later, hinted at a layer of decision-making that official histories only partially acknowledged. The disappearance of the orders from clear documentation also reflected a broader truth about modern warfare. Decisions made under extreme pressure are rarely preserved in full. They are filtered through propaganda, post-war justification, and the need for coherent narratives. The orders that had once shaped the fate of nations were now scattered across archives, footnotes, and memories, their influence undeniable yet their details elusive. By the war's end, the immediate consequences of the orders had merged into the larger story of global conflict. Yet their legacy endured in the evolution of military doctrine, the cautionary lessons of overconfidence, and the enduring question of how much of history is written and how much quietly erased. From this uncertainty emerges a deeper reflection on war itself and on the fragile human decisions that shape it. In the end, the orders that changed the war did not vanish because they failed. They disappeared because they succeeded too well. Their effects were visible in broken front lines, altered doctrines, and the stunned silence that followed the collapse of long-held assumptions about how wars were fought. Yet the words themselves, typed, signed, and passed through human hands, were quietly absorbed into outcome rather than preserved as cause. History remembered what happened. It was less certain about how narrowly it might not have happened at all. War is often remembered through battles and dates, through victories declared and defeats mourned. But beneath those landmarks lie decisions made in confined rooms, under dim light, by individuals who could not see the full shape of the future. The orders issued in early 1940 were not acts of destiny. They were calculated risks, shaped by fear, ambition, uncertainty, and belief in speed over caution. Their execution depended not just on strategy, but on the endurance of soldiers, the reliability of machines, and the fragile thread of communication that tied intent to action. That these orders later faded from clear record is not an anomaly. It is a reminder that modern warfare often outpaces its own documentation. What survives is shaped by politics, by memory, and by the need to impose coherence on chaos. Some truths become inconvenient. Others are simply too complex to fit cleanly into official narratives. Yet the legacy of these decisions remains. They transformed how wars would be planned and fought for decades to come. They demonstrated the power and danger of speed, surprise, and centralized command. And they revealed a sobering reality that the course of history can hinge on directives few fully understand, carried out by people who bear their consequences long after the paper itself is gone. In studying what disappeared, we come closer to understanding what truly endures, not just the movement of armies, but the weight of human choice in moments when the world is balanced, briefly and precariously, on a single order.